I'm going to be presenting a very small proportion and very preliminary results from a mixed method study looking at land and livelihood strategies of rural households in Orissa. It actually forms part of a four-arm cluster randomized control trial looking at agriculture and nutrition linkages using digital platforms called UPAVAN, which stands for Upscaling Participatory Action and Videos for Agriculture and Nutrition. And these are partners who provide technical research and implementation assistance. Before I begin, and I know it would be difficult to have your thoughts, but can you please take a pause and consider if you were to ask rural women that if we have land in your name, what would they say? Any quick responses? Does anyone have a burning desire to respond to this question right away? They would say no. I can see some people nodding their heads. They'll say yes. Okay, that's a man saying. Yeah? Okay, interesting. So to break the suspense, I begin with the conclusions of my study so that you remember. When we asked this question to women in focus group discussions, the responses ranged from instantaneously rejecting the idea, thinking that it's not feasible, how is it going to work, versus some who tended to prefer the status quo. They would say that we anyways do all the activities jointly, so having it in our name is not going to make much of a difference. Whereas there were very few, maybe a couple of them, who were very ambitious and who thought that this is actually going to help them be more self-reliant, and they thought that this would be a desirable outcome. So why is it important to understand these norms, and what do they mean for how people use land and own land and control different decisions related to land? Some background for this study. You all may be aware of the historical context of land rights movements in India, especially in West Bengal and Eastern India, and also women's rights to land, owning it jointly or solely, and the incentives for it in India. But as nutrition agriculture people, we also know while designing programs, we try to empower women. That's one of our key pathways where we try to bridge the gap between agriculture and nutrition. But the literature actually says that there is not enough evidence. We don't know how much of land which is individually owned is actually in the name of women versus what is owned by men. And there's quite a lot of literature on that, which is very surprising. So having looked at this literature, we pose these research questions, which is what I'll try to answer preliminarily in this presentation. How does women's land ownership, agriculture control, and agricultural productive decision making affect their livelihood strategies? And in turn, what do these different livelihood typologies mean for their nutritional outcomes? In this particular presentation, I will focus on the linkages between different typologies of land ownership at the household level, depending on size and who owns the land, whether women own it or not. And then what does it mean for the different agricultural production strategies, by which I mean their strategies to earn income or to source their food. And then what does it mean for maternal dietary diversity? I will also include some perceptions of women, which I presented earlier. To get more details about the intervention, about the trial, and the outcomes, you can look at the protocol that we published this year. If you want further details, I'm happy to chat about it. But to give a background of the geography of where this research is being undertaken, it's part of 148 clusters in rural Keonjhar, 4 blocks there. And this presentation actually focuses on a mixed methods approach. A baseline survey was conducted in 2016-17. 4,480 households were part of it. And this year, we conducted a qualitative study interviewing 32 individuals from households, and also 6 focus group discussions in these villages with women self-help groups. The data was analyzed thematically using NVivo. That's an interesting picture. We'll come back to it. It's actually a qualitative participatory exercise looking at land typologies on people, whether they own land or not, and whether they do agriculture or not. Basic description about the respondent categories across the three methods that we have used. It's very detailed, so just to remember, those are the different typologies of land holding sizes that we are interested in, and also whether women own land or not. The quantitative survey actually showed that only about 17% of households where women owned land. Context analysis from the qualitative research actually shows that agricultural practices were often seasonal, which is not uncommon in these areas. They did paddy cultivation during the monsoons, and basically because of constraints of water availability throughout the season, they couldn't grow different crops. Some did report saying homestead gardening or livestock production. But land was primarily owned by men. Keonjhar is a patrilineal society where land is passed on along the men in the households. Mostly respondents would say that the land was in the name of the father-in-law, but they would actually participate in different agricultural activities, and only if they were either newly married or pregnant or were responsible for taking care of young children or elderly or sick people in their households would they be limited from participating in agriculture. Now focusing on the linkages between what do these different land ownership patterns mean for different agricultural strategies. Some basic socioeconomic characteristics of different households. The first graph is actually talking about marginal versus small versus medium to large households, and what are the characteristics here in terms of education, their tribal status, and whether the spouse is at home or not. It will actually get interesting to see the different strategies that they deploy thereby. And the second graph actually compares households where women own land versus households where women do have some land. And again, it's interesting to note education and spouse being away from home, and how does it affect what agricultural activities they undertake or what crops they grow. In respect to the exercise that I was mentioning to you earlier, when we asked women in focus groups, what do households do where they own land and they do farming? How do they procure their food? They actually relied on the income that they got from the sale of their produce, and they purchased vegetables or different things from the market. On the second quadrant up, where people owned land, households, they owned land but did not do farming for multiple reasons. Either they were working in service, or they leased out their land and engaged laborers to do agriculture during monsoons. In the lower quadrants, on to my right, where households do not own land but still do agriculture, they relied on either their social networks, their cousins, or their neighbors to do agriculture. Or they would engage in sharecropping, or have some homestead land where they would cultivate some vegetables. And often they relied on daily wage labor. Similarly, for households that did not own any land and did not engage in agriculture as well, they relied on majorly on the public distribution system for kerosene, rice, and wheat sometimes. But there were a lot of irregularities coming in from the qualitative data, where they said for the last 2 years, actually, it's not functional. We have complained, and still no action has been taken. They also did small businesses or engaged as drivers, and migrated to cities like Bangalore seasonally for earning income. So one quote here which actually illustrates how women who did not own land would actually source food in their households is they relied on the market or the government, and then actually relied on the daily wage labor to have food in their household. In the same groups that we've been looking at, the different household sizes across the different groups in marginal, small, and medium landholding sizes, we see that assets are actually higher for people who have medium to large scale households, land. Whereas in groups where women don't own land versus where women own land, the asset doesn't make much of a difference. It's actually quite same. Now focusing on agricultural production strategies and then what do they mean for maternal dietary diversity. Uh, Women's dietary diversity in these land-owning households is actually very similar for starchy staples, irrespective of who owns land and how much land they own. But if you look further down the different food groups and the number of food groups, you see that the more land you have, it actually means you grow more than 5 food groups, which is also interesting for women who do own land in their household. They also tend to have more than 5 food groups. The proportion is slightly higher there. Some of the perceptions that women actually expressed when they were positive about having land in their own name, it actually made them feel more secure. They think that they would be able to save some money, make decisions about what to do with the money, and have savings for, say, emergency expenses. They would also say that actually women should get first priority or should have joint ownership, because then they don't have to rely on someone to make such decisions. Some key takeaways and for this next steps that we are going to think of. In households where women do own land, there is actually potential for growing nutritious foods and for controlling income from sale of the produce. We've looked at the different determinants: caste, tribal status, education, and whether a spouse is around in the house or not, to see whether size of land holding and whether women own the land or not. How does that influence? And one of the other key pathways that we are now looking at is actually gendered dimensions of decision making and involvement in agriculture. And this will be further analyzed and unpacked over the next phase of the qualitative data collection next year, and of course in the end line as well. Thank you.